You can turn to Colossians chapter 3. Turn to Colossians chapter 3. I know that might come as somewhat of a surprise to some of you when we said we were going to conclude Colossians last week in chapter 4. But we're going to look again at verses 18 and 19 today of Colossians chapter 3. I'll read it before I begin the sermon. Wives, submit to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, and do not be harsh with them. So you may be wondering why are we returning back to Colossians again, and specifically chapter 3, verses 18 and 19. And there's a couple of reasons for it. Paul and I, as we were discussing, before we move on, we didn't really feel like when we went through verses 18 and 19 the first time that we gave enough attention to husbands. We were kind of hard on the wives, which is a little bit unfair. And in addition to that, my assignment for the summer, what I'll be preaching from, is the wisdom literature from the Bible. And one of the books that I wanted to preach from is the Song of Songs. And so the point at which those two reasons sort of converge is the sermon that I have today. And we're primarily going to be considering verse 19. And so what I'm going to do, my text is Colossians 3, 18 and 19. But we're going to look at what it means to be a loving husband sort of through the lens of the book of Song of Songs, which I've been, and Kelly as well, applying my mind to for the past month or so. So I have listed there, you might have already seen in your bulletin, some of the characteristics of a husband's love that we can sort of derive from the Old Testament book of the Song of Songs. And we'll be looking through each one of those today. But before we do, I think there's one thing that's really important to remember when we're reading, and specifically when we're applying the book of the Song of Songs. And that's this, that it is more a description of marital love, or the love between a man and a woman, than it is a prescription for love. It's a song that tells a story of one couple's loving courtship, from which we can derive principles that can be applied to every marriage relationship. But I think that it shouldn't be read and applied as if every single marriage relationship is to be a carbon copy of what we find in the book. And I think that's why the Spirit of God has allowed it to be written in that metaphorical way, which actually makes it hard to interpret. But because it's metaphorical like that, it leaves a lot of room for interpretation. It leaves room for us to make application to our individual wives and our individual husbands, each one of which is different. And every marriage experience is different. So as we go through these, I don't want you to see it as like, well, this is a formula, this is exactly how I am to be, and if I am this way, then my wife will be this way. Or if I am this way, then my husband will be this way. It's creative, it's poetic, it's artistic. You're going to have to use wisdom yourself to discern how this might apply to your own marriage relationship. The Song of Songs is a story. I believe that it's one story told from the perspective of a young woman who has an overwhelming desire to yield herself to the young man in the story who is the object of her love. And I think that's a good way we could summarize the Song of Songs in one sentence. It is a song that tells a story about a young woman who is so overcome with love for the man in the story that she desires to give herself to him in marriage, and he her. Prior to their wedding, at one point in the song, she says of him in chapter 1, verse 13, "My beloved to me is a sachet of myrrh that lies between my breasts." This sachet of myrrh may have been a wedding gift she was referencing of nard or perfume, which she would open on their wedding day. In modern language, what she's saying is, I can't sleep because I'm consumed with the thought of when I finally get to be with my betrothed. She's always thinking about him. She can't sleep because she's thinking about him. Now, husbands, wouldn't it be nice to have your wife think of you that way? I think so. So what kind of characteristics define a man's love that would result in a woman or your wife desiring to yield herself, to submit herself to you in that way? What kind of characteristics can we find? What kind of characteristics define the love that Paul calls husbands to in Colossians chapter 3? Well, if you look on your bulletin, the first one there is patience. The first characteristic of a loving husband is patience. You can go to the next slide, Roger. I thought we might as well start with the easy one. We see this principle right at the end of verse 19. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. And so this really balances out the call to the wives who are asked to submit in verse 18. Yes, the expectation of the wife is to yield to the authority of her husband, the headship of her husband. But the expectation put on the husband is that he would be a patient and reasonable person to submit to. Someone who doesn't have idealistic and unreasonable expectations of her. One of the first things you might notice about the Song of Songs, if you were to read through it, is that the story takes place in a garden, and it continues to revisit that idea. Solomon had cultivated many gardens for himself, full of plants that were beautiful both visually and sensually and aromatically. The experience of falling in love is so enjoyable that the only way it could be described is to borrow language that's reminiscent of what took place in the Garden of Eden. It's like the woman in the story is saying, this experience of falling in love with my husband is so wonderful. It's so sensual and so beautiful. It's comparable to paradise. But, of course, we understand that now we don't live in that state of paradise. We don't live in that kind of a world. When we fall in love, it may kind of feel like it and be comparable to it. But that's not the state in which we live. Our world isn't perfect, and our wives aren't perfect. And as husbands, we'll never be perfect. And therefore, one of the qualities or characteristics that a husband must have if he's going to be loving is patience, is reasonableness. He's going to have an appropriate standard of expectation for his wife. It wasn't so long ago, in Colossians chapter 3, verse 13, that Paul instructed there, in the midst of giving all these principles that they're to live by, giving all these instructions and commands and exhortations, be like this, be humble, etc. He says, be forgiving. Be forgiving. Since you have been raised with Christ, he says in Colossians 3:1, so live as if you already have been resurrected. Live as if you already live in that state of paradise. But recognize this. In order to really sanctify and make holy your marriage, you're going to have to overlook when your spouse sins. You're going to have to be forgiving. To be a loving husband, you're going to have to be patient. You're going to have to be reasonable. And when you do, is when you'll truly love like Christ. Secondly, a husband's love provides. A husband's love provides. Now, this is one that you could really take the wrong way, and I don't want you to. And this is where that whole idea of it being metaphorical, I think, really comes into play. I don't want you to understand this principle in too narrow of a way. I can't stress enough that the song is one couple's story, as I already said, from which we can derive characteristics of a husband's love that apply to all husbands. Let me give you the example from the song. In chapter 1, the woman is mistreated by members of her family. She is forced to care for the vineyard of her mother's sons, it says. And as a result, her own vineyard was not cared for. It was neglected. And so Solomon, the man in the story, invites her to come where he pastures his flock. And when he does, he promises her jewelry of gold studded with silver. He provides for her in the exact area in which she needed to be provided for. But I'll also note she works there. And she's invited to come work and help pasture his flock as well. And so I think that informs us that a husband can provide in a number of different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to mean his career choice or that he has to make more money than his wife. It may include something like that, but I think to define it that way would be too narrow, too exclusive. A husband who seeks to provide for his wife will see where and when, with what she is in need, and the desire of his heart will be to make provision for those needs in whatever way he can. Now, this is one of the characteristics that I think pictures the gospel really well, because we were in a similar state as the woman. We were cruelly treated by sin. We were enslaved by sin, oppressed by sin, forced to serve it, doing things we wished we wouldn't do because of sin. And Jesus came to us, he comes to us in the gospel, and he invites us to follow him and come to help and be involved in shepherding his, pasturing his flock, and leave that oppressive place. Ephesians 2:7 says, so that in the coming ages he, that's God, might show the immeasurable riches of his grace and kindness toward us in Christ Jesus. Everything that Christ is to God the Father, so we who believe in Christ are too. He shares everything with us. There is nothing that's Christ's that is not also the believer's. And in the same way, a loving husband shares and desires to give and provide for his wife with everything that he has. Whatever is his is also hers. A loving husband provides. The third characteristic of a husband's love you'd find there on your outline is that a husband's love protects. A husband's love protects. In the woman's dream in chapter 3 of the song, the bride describes her beloved as Solomon. Now, there's some interpretations that suggest maybe it's not Solomon, maybe it is. We'll let that go for this morning. But in chapter 3, she's dreaming, and she dreams of her beloved, and he's Solomon. And she describes him as being surrounded by an army of 60 men who are armed and trained in war. And it's very protection. Maybe it was related to the fact that she was mistreated from before. And so I think it may include physical protection, but I know you haven't read the whole book of Song of Solomon, and most likely, but if you take what she sees, how she sees her beloved in context of the whole book, I think this has to be a metaphor for protecting more than just her physical self, but even the love that they have. He's protective of the love that they have. Let me explain what I mean. At the end of chapter 2, this is prior to the consummation of their wedding. After both the young woman and the young man have described the intensity of their feelings for one another, in verse 17, she asks him to turn and be like a gazelle. She's asking him to go away, to leave. Listen to Song of Solomon 2:15. Catch the foxes for us, the little foxes that spoil the vineyards, for our vineyards are in blossom. She is heeding the own advice that she gives to her young lady friends in the chorus of the song, which we find in chapter 2, verse 7. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or the does of the field, that you not stir up or awaken love until it pleases. Remember, their vineyards in blossom. What does she mean by that? She's saying it's not time yet. The fruit hasn't come on the branches yet. It's still in the blossom stage. It's not ready. And so therefore she says, go, be like a gazelle. Our desires are too intense. The love is too intense. So go away from me until the right time. And how does the husband figure respond? It says in Song of Solomon 4:6, until the day breathes and the shadows flee. Now that's a reference to the time when they will consummate their marriage. I will go away to the mountain of myrrh and to the hill of frankincense. Myrrh and frankincense, and I think this is probably the best way to interpret what he's saying there. Myrrh and frankincense were two substances that were fragrant, but they symbolize holiness. They were used in the temple to sanctify the temple utensils. They applied myrrh and frankincense to the utensils in the temple, and that made them holy and pure. And so I think what the husband figure is indicating here is that I'm going to turn and go away from you because the time for love is not right, to keep myself pure and holy. Why? Because he desires to protect their love. Husband's love protects. The fourth word I have on the outline, and this is the one I like best, and if I have a main point for today, it is this one, that husband's love is pleasant. And if you remember one thing, this is the one I want you to remember, the pleasantness of a husband's love. And it's a very Hebrew thing for me to do, to place that one in the middle, because it's the most important. And we actually could have it like an umbrella under which all the other characteristics fit. So for this one, we got to go back to Colossians 3:19. It says again, husbands, love your wives, and in particular, this part is what we'll look at, and do not be harsh with them. The word translated harsh there is actually metaphorical language, similar to the Song of Songs. It's a picture that Paul is giving them in Greek. The word is pikreno, and it means to be bitter or to make bitter or to taste something bitter. When we were kids, I remember we had one of those pools that you could set up outside, the ones that, not the nice ones, we had one of the blue ones with like the big blue inflatable thing on top. And it was fun, and it was in my parents' yard, and my parents were so kind that they made it close enough to our chokecherry trees that we could pick chokecherries while we were in the pool and eat them. And I remember asking Dad, can we eat those berries as a kid? And he's like, yeah, sure, they're not harmful, whatever. But, I expected it to be like a cherry or a plum, some kind of fruit that I was used to eating that you'd bite into it and it was juicy and sweet. But what happened when I bit into that chokecherry? What did I find? What was my experience? You guys know. It's just really a surprisingly bitter taste. And I went like this, And that's the picture Paul's giving. He's saying, as a husband, don't be that to your wife. She expects you to be a refreshing, sweet to the taste kind of husband. Don't do things that embitter her. Now, in total contrast to this, when we turn to the song, in chapter 2, verse 3, listen to how the woman describes her beloved. As an apple tree among the trees of the forest, so is my beloved among the young men. Now remember, she had been working hard in the sun. And she says, with great delight, I sat in his shadow, and his fruit was sweet to my taste. She describes him in the exact opposite way of what Paul says to the husbands in Colossae, what he tells them not to be. She says, the idea of him, the thought of him, the presence of him is pleasant and sweet. And this is where I guess I'm just going to rant for a little bit, because this is where the metaphor thing comes in really well too. Because what might be sweet to my wife and refreshing might be different to your wife. And this is where we can't just paint with a broad brush. Because on Tuesday evening, what might be the thing that's refreshing to my wife is that I come into the house and I come into the kitchen and I put my arm around her and I kiss her forehead. Right? But if I wake up Wednesday morning and I think, man, that really worked last night, I'm going to try it again this morning, and I put my arm around her and I kiss her forehead, and she's like, get away. I'm busy. I'm trying to wash the dishes or something. See? We have to be wise. We have to know our wives. Peter says, dwell with your wives according to knowledge. We have to know what's appropriate in each moment. We can't make things formulaic. We have to work. We have to pay attention. We have to think about, as husbands, what is it that my wife would find refreshing and desirable? What can I do that would make her see me as a pleasant person to be around? I invite you to apply your mind to that if you're a husband. Proverbs 25:25 says, just as cold water is to a thirsty soul, so is good news from a far country. That's really a prophecy about the gospel. And that's the picture of a loving husband. He's refreshing. He's a welcome sight to his wife. The next word on your outline is possessive. I don't want to spend too much time on this one. A husband's love is possessive. Listen to Song of Solomon 8:6. This is after the consummation at the end of the book. Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm. For love is strong as death. Jealousy is fierce as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, the very flame of the Lord. Do you hear what the bride is saying to her husband right after they consummate the marriage? In modern language, chapter 8, verse 6 says, "No one but me," says the wife. "No one but me has access to your heart." And the ancient Hebrews, they didn't separate the heart from the mind like we do today. We think of heart and we think it's only our affections, and our mind is more the intellectual part. But the Hebrews didn't do that. They saw all of the thinking taking place in a person's heart. Everything internal belongs to me, says the wife, and everything external. No one but me gets access to your body. I'm sealed on your heart and on your arm. 1 Corinthians 7 seems to indicate that the same principle is true in reverse. I do want to say before we move on, there is a kind of possessiveness that is unhealthy in relationships. You might be aware of that. 1 Corinthians 13:4 warns against such unhealthy, which says, "Love does not envy." It's the kind of possessiveness that is only seeking its own interest in the other person. It's selfish. It's just control. The kind of possessiveness this wife is describing isn't self-seeking. It's seeking the good of the other person, saying, "You are mine. Our love is exclusive. It should not be shared with anyone else." That's the good kind. The not good kind would be the kind that says, "I'm going to just control your life because I'm afraid you're going to do something bad to me." So, a husband's love is possessive in the most positive way to understand the word. The next one, this is another one that I really was excited to get to because I think it's kind of countercultural. A husband's love is platonic. A husband's love is platonic. And that means like friendship, an affection that is not necessarily connected to sexual desire. 5 times in the song, the man addresses his bride as his sister. After describing his physical beauty in detail at the beginning of chapter 4 and how he longs for it, he then changes to describing the beauty of her love. And when he makes this change in the song, he addresses her not just as his beloved or as his bride, but as his sister. As his sister. And I think we can derive from that the kind of love that a husband should have for his wife is not purely based on physical attraction, should not purely be based on what she looks like. A husband should desire his wife in ways that exceed physical attraction. That's what the husband figure is saying at the end of chapter 4 in the song. Listen to verse 10. "How beautiful is not your body, but your love, my sister, my bride. How much better is your love than wine, and the fragrance of your oils than any spice." He doesn't just want her now. That's what he's saying. He's saying, "I want to be a family with you." By calling her his sister, he's saying, "I want you for life." In modern times, we do sometimes, and maybe it's connected to that whole heart-mind thing, we do sometimes separate emotional intimacy and physical intimacy. We try and divide them up like they're separate. And we just divide people up into neat little parts. And I can be one way emotionally and then be a different person physically. That's kind of what the Gnostics believed. But as countercultural as this may seem, as husbands, we need to learn to love our wives as passionately on the emotional level as we would on the physical level. And I have one suggestion for you if you're a husband in order to do this, and that would be to pray with your wife. To pray with her. Pray with her alone. Pray with her about everything. During Kelly and I's courtship phase, I remember Pastor Shada very specifically instructing us not to pray together. Now, why did he do that as a dating couple? Because he was concerned that we would develop an emotional intimacy that was very close. And why would he be concerned about that? Because what could eventually happen as that emotional intimacy grows is that it would seek to express itself in physical intimacy. Why? Because we're one being. We aren't divided up. What we do with our emotions affects what we do with our bodies. What we do with our minds affects what we do. We're all connected. And so we have to be wise. We have to be careful. We have to cultivate emotional connection in our marriages. And the husbands need to be the ones to take the initiative to do that. I also thought of Christ with this one as well, how he would spend long days and nights healing people and in prayer for people, agonizing in love for people. The most often used adjective of Jesus in the New Testament, I believe, is compassion. He was emotionally invested in the way that he loved people. And so also, husbands, we should be emotionally invested in loving our wives. Finally, the last one, persistent. A husband's love is persistent or unwavering. Ian Duguid makes the observation in his commentary on the song that at various points in the story, the attention of the woman seems to be here and there. She doesn't always have the same singular, consistent focus on her husband and his beauty or whatever. Primarily she is, but she interacts with the other female friends. She talks about her mistreatment from the brothers. She's occupied with other things. And then sometimes she's like, well, oh, my husband's there and I love him, but like I don't want to get out of bed because, it's like she's like all over the place. Her response or her lack of response, though, never affects the husband's response to her. He is like singular in his focus. Every time he speaks, it's dead on directed at her, and it's affirming her and her beauty and his desire for her. Every single time he speaks, I desire you, I desire you, I desire you. It's like really simple, but it's really unwavering, and it's really, I think, something that women would find desirable, to have that consistent affirmation that she's desirable, that he wants her. That's the message that we get from the husband. It's persistent, it's consistent. It never wavers. It's not conditional. It doesn't change. And this, too, I think, is a great picture of the gospel. If you're a Christian, have you ever, I do all the time, had insecurities? Have you ever wondered, how is it that Christ can love me in the way that's described in the Scriptures? How can he love me like that? There's no way. I look at myself and what do I see? I don't see beauty, I see sin. I see shortcomings, I see failures. But Christ, when he looks at me with his eyes, because he's the one who has the power to make me pure and holy, that's what he sees. And so listen to what the man says to the woman in the song 4:7. You are altogether beautiful, my love. There is no flaw in you. Now, obviously, that's an exaggeration. Obviously, she had flaws. But to him, she had no flaws. And in the same way, to Christ, his church, we have no flaws. He makes us pure and perfect and holy by transferring his righteousness to us. He's unwavering. He's persistent in his affirmation. So in conclusion, and you can go to the final slide, Roger, those are some of the characteristics of what it means for a husband to love his wife in a Christ-like way. But how do we make application of this? I always, whenever I'm preparing a sermon, I always try to ask myself that question. Okay, this is the information. This is the information I'm learning. What are we supposed to do with this information? How are we to make application of it? Wives, what should you do with what you've learned about what it means to be, for your husband to be loving? And husbands, what should you do? Well, I think the first thing we should do is consider, what did the writer of the song do? How did he apply it? Back to the end of chapter 8, I want to read verse 7 to you. It says this: many waters cannot quench love. He gets done with this whole description of what love is. And then they have the consummation of it, the climax, the high point. And then he says this: many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it. If a man offered for love all the wealth of his house, he would be utterly despised. He essentially just steps back and says, look at this, the intensity of this love. It can't be stopped. It can't be quenched. It can't be drowned. It can't be made impure by bribery or by money. It's almost unexplainable. He just wonders and celebrates the beauty of it. Now, why is that significant? I think it's super significant. Because what we're supposed to do with the song is not go home to our husband and say, hey, guess what Pastor said? You're not measuring up, you're not measuring up, you're not measuring up. But rather, we're supposed to celebrate. How is my husband like Christ to me? How does he love me like Christ? And to just enjoy and be thankful for the fact that you get to participate in a marriage that portrays the love that Christ has for believers. He steps back, he celebrates. So in conclusion, I think you husbands is simply this: recognize the great gift and responsibility and privilege that you've been given by God to love your wife as Christ loved the church. Not everybody gets to participate in that. And I think we as husbands, more times than not, don't recognize that. And so I want you to think about, what are the things you could say? What are the things you could do? What are the things that would cause your wife to view you as that refreshing presence, that pleasant presence, rather than a bitter one? What are her needs that you can provide for? What are her fears that you can protect her from? What are some areas that she needs that persistent affirmation? And for you wives, I wanted to say one thing to you as well, because my big concern in preparing for this was this, and that's what I couldn't seem to get out of my mind, is that you would take this home and use it as kind of like a stick to make your husband do what you want him to do. But remember, this is more a description of love than it is a prescription for love. And I'd encourage you to be like the bride in the song. Look at your husband, and whatever it is you can celebrate and find praiseworthy about him, do that. What you see in him that's like Christ, celebrate that and let him know what he does. I have one illustration with which I'll close. I was listening to Christian radio during when things in Ukraine were really starting to ramp up. And I remember hearing about the refugees leaving, and there was a pastor that wanted to send his wife and family away to the States so that she would be safe, and he was going to remain there in the Ukraine to minister. And I remember they said on the radio what the wife said about her husband. She said, "I'm not going to leave my pastor. I'm not going to leave my pastor." And I mean, that's being refreshing. That brother was doing something right? I got to give you one more. Sorry, I know I told you just one. But Kelly and I were sitting with a couple we respect, an older couple, and the guy, I love him dearly, but he's a talker and he's a storyteller. And I haven't spent that much time with him, but he was telling a story that even I had heard before. And his wife was sitting there. And so you have to know she's heard this story. And you guys, he got to the end of the story, and his wife chimes in. She's a very quiet person. And you know what she said? No eye rolls, no criticism. She goes, "You forgot the part about, I don't even remember." Can you believe that? That brother's doing something right, isn't he? She respects him. He's a refreshing presence to her. Okay, I've gone on too long. Let's conclude in prayer, and as I pray, the worship team can come up. Father God, I just pray that we would seek as much as we can as husbands to love our wives and to value the fact that we get to participate in marriage. But at the same time, Father, I just pray for a forgiving spirit over all of us. I just pray for a positive attitude, for eyes that look to see how we can celebrate our spouse and how they are so much like you to us. And Father, in the ways that our spouse is deficient, I think maybe even of marriage relationships that are unequally yoked and how challenging and difficult that might be, Father, I pray especially for those spouses that Christ himself would be a husband to the wife in that situation, or be what the wife is not to the husband who finds himself in that situation, Father. We recognize we won't experience perfection on this side of eternity. We just ask that through a relationship with you, we can look forward to the day when you do return and all things will be set to right. For this reason, we praise you and ask these things in Christ's name. Amen.